They knew that coronavirus had happened back in December. They sent a delegation to the White House to shake everybody's hand. They knew that they had this virus that had started for the phase 1. Then they sent the largest delegation ever to Davos. And now the ambassador to China was on one of the Sunday shows this weekend, and he did not deny that coronavirus could have started in a weapons lab. Do we know if this started in a research lab, and how come they won't allow the CDC in there to better understand how this started? Because if they started this in a weapons lab, that's evidence that they are developing or trying to develop weapons of mass destruction, biological weapons.
For the first time, an American has died from the virus. The U.S. Embassy confirming the 60-year-old victim died at a hospital in Wuhan, China, the epicenter of the outbreak.
I want to send my condolences to the loved ones of the United States citizen who fell victim to the coronavirus in Wuhan.
New video showing hundreds of infected patients being moved into a new hospital in Wuhan, built in just 10 days.
Passengers on a flight from the U.S. to the U.K. leaving from San Francisco were told by the pilot someone on board might have coronavirus. One passenger says they were told to stay in their seats. It was never confirmed, but it was certainly alarming. And tonight, China now revealing the virus has sickened more than 1,700 medical workers on the front lines. 6 have died. They are also now expanding mass roundups to contain the virus to include people who might have coronavirus, not just confirmed cases.
Tonight, a scare on this United Airlines jet landing in London.
The captain announced that the person had a suspected case of the coronavirus and that we were all to keep in our seats.
All 251 passengers were released, but it's just the latest false alarm for already jittery travelers. Experts at home say the virus could last into next year.
The U.S. government is now preparing to evacuate nearly 400 Americans stranded on a cruise ship in Japan.
Many look forward to a cruise vacation, but these folks have been stuck on this ship for a week and a half. And when they get back to the U.S., they will go back into quarantine.
Tensions are running pretty high.
This morning, plans now underway to evacuate nearly 400 Americans stranded aboard the quarantined Diamond Princess. The cruise ship docked in Japan for more than 11 days. At least 285 people on board have tested positive for the COVID-19 virus, including another 67 new cases announced just today. The U.S. Embassy says the emergency evacuation will begin tomorrow. All Americans who show no symptoms and want to leave will be flown back to the U.S., where they'll undergo another 2 weeks of quarantine.
All right, this is it. We're about to step into the big wide world, so I have to put my mask on and get going.
Bye.
Cheryl Molsky and her husband Paul are from Syracuse in New York State. After being cooped up on the ship for 12 days, they've agreed to be flown back to the US, where they'll spend another 14 days in isolation. They shot this cell phone video of their own evacuation, in this case at least, a good-natured event.
Okay. The bus will take you to the airplane takes you to the United States, and then you get your passport. All good with that?
Okay.
Tonight, hundreds of Americans exposed to the coronavirus are now back in the U.S., evacuated by the State Department from a cruise ship in Japan. Today, a top government scientist here in Washington says they were rescued because the quarantine on board the Diamond Princess failed. 14 of those Americans tested positive for the virus. Now, they were kept separate from the other passengers and are now being treated at U.S. hospitals.
Crews in protective suits greeted the Americans as the 2 charter flights landed in Texas and here at Travis Air Force Base in California. U.S. officials said the quarantine on the Diamond Princess in Japan had failed. 14 evacuees tested positive for the virus and had to be isolated from other passengers.
All right, careful, that's the smoke.
Many chronicled their journey on social media as they finally left the ship and boarded buses before flying.
We just landed, Carl and I, in Nebraska.
Jerry Cerati Goldman and her husband Carl were among those who traveled to Epley Airfield outside Omaha.
Clearly, these were folks that had a high index of suspicion that came to us, and so all of them, we knew that we would evaluate them.
This is our greeting team.
This was the scene at the base as they arrived. Goldman's husband developed respiratory symptoms in transit and is currently being tested.
I'm not able to leave this room at all.
She's being housed on a medical center campus. There is also concern about the more than 2,000 passengers and crew members who were aboard the cruise ship Westerdam. They disembarked in Cambodia and had been given the all clear, but an American woman who had been a passenger now has tested positive. And health officials in Hawaii are now tracing the contacts of a Japanese couple who vacationed in Maui and Honolulu. Both were diagnosed with the coronavirus after returning home.
Tonight, 2.5 million residents in one Korean city ordered to stay indoors after a woman who authorities called a super spreader infected dozens in her own church.
94% of new cases continue to come from Hubei province. Outside China, WHO has received reports of 694 cases from 25 countries and 3 deaths. As more data comes in from China, we're starting to get a clearer picture of the outbreak.
The number of people infected with the coronavirus has surged past the 70,000 mark.
Tonight, the number of cases worldwide now tops 73,000.
Number of confirmed coronavirus cases now stands at more than 75,000, this including 23 in North America.
Developments surrounding the coronavirus. There are confirmed cases in nearly 30 countries and more than 2,100 people dead.
More than 2,400 people have now died in mainland China. Confirmed cases there are rapidly approaching 77,000. Across the rest of the world, officials report 20 deaths and almost 2,000 infections. Well, China has held its biggest crisis meeting of senior government and military officials since the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak. State media says that President Xi Jinping told the teleconference that it is the worst health emergency in the 70-year history of the People's Republic. And he plans to roll out a series of measures, including tax cuts for businesses to kickstart the country's battered economy.
And companies like Adidas, Puma, Tyson Foods, and Apple are all warning about the potential negative impact the virus could have on their businesses.
Meanwhile, the effects of the coronavirus are spreading to the tech world, with Apple announcing today its quarterly earnings could be lower than expected because of a production cut in iPhones in China.
I think it's people are afraid. You see that in terms of the dramatic drop in certain industries. Obviously, anything having to do with transportation, airlines, trains, hotels, restaurants, gymnasiums, movie theaters, malls, anything that has a public exposure, people are very sensitive to. That's why you see the online activity and e-commerce growing. And I suspect that that's going to be a more permanent change as people get used to that, a trend that was occurring anyway, but now will be accelerating.
The broader economic impact still to be determined, but what we are seeing are companies now coming forward with the earnings season, talking about the kind of impact they're likely to see. We started the week with the announcement coming from Apple saying that they are likely to not meet their revenue target this quarter because they simply have supply chain issues. The factories that they rely on over in China had a very long Lunar New Year because of concerns of the outbreak. There are concerns about being able to obtain some of the supplies that are needed in their gadgets, like the iPhone. And then, of course, we've heard from car makers like Land Rover or like a Nissan saying, look, even if our factories are outside of China, we can't get the parts that come from China. And so we're starting to see this ripple effect.
The spike in COVID-19 cases has prompted more questions for doctors on how the virus spreads. And at this stage, what do we know about this virus? How did it come to be? How did it become what it is now? And what is it mutating into? Do we have a sense of any of that?
We do know from published material that the virus is very similar to an Asian bat coronavirus. So in that respect, it's not so different from coronavirus that caused SARS and the one that caused the Middle East respiratory disease, both of which had origins in bat populations. And one of the questions is, was there an intermediate animal vector, such as the Asian anteater, much like the camel was the intermediate vector in the Middle East?
Meanwhile, South Korea has raised its disease alert to the highest level due to the rapid rise of the coronavirus cases. At a news conference this morning, the president called the country on red alert. It allows the government to send extra resources to hard-hit areas and to prevent public activities. Health officials reported 169 new infections today, bringing the total in South Korea to 602. Many of the country's new cases have been linked to a church congregation. More than 9,000 church members are in self-quarantine. Since the first confirmed case last month, at least 5 people have died from the virus in that country. Meanwhile, Iran is struggling to contain its own coronavirus outbreak. Rebecca Collard is tracking the latest on this story from Beirut and joins us now. So let's talk about the latest number of people infected by coronavirus in Iran. Rebecca?
Yeah, John. So we have Iranian health officials this morning saying that number is now 43, which is up from 28 yesterday. So a jump of 15 people, which is very significant, John. And on top of that, another death, which brings the total number of deaths in the country to 8, which is also quite a lot considering, as you just said, there's only been 20 deaths outside of China. So we have almost half of those in Iran. So quite an escalating situation there. We also got some interesting details from the health minister today, John, because there was a lot of talk about how the coronavirus managed to make it to Iran. Now, what the health minister said this morning was that they believe that it was actually an Iranian merchant who traveled often to China, who brought the virus back to the city of Qom, and that's where most of the cases in Iran have been, in this religious center, this city of Qom. And that patient has died since bringing the virus into the country. And the last thing I would say is that they said Iran says they actually had stopped these direct flights to Iran. That this person who brought the virus to Iran actually managed to get an indirect flight. So interesting details this morning, and I think a very concerning situation in Iran, John.